It was a late winter evening, and the air was crisp, biting at my cheeks as I walked home from work. The streets were unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, the crunch of your boots on the snow, the distant hum of a car engine, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I had taken this route countless times before, but tonight something felt off. Maybe it was the way the streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement, or the way the wind seemed to carry whispers that I couldn't quite make out. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I worked late shifts at a small bookstore downtown, and while I loved the job, the walk home always left me on edge. The neighborhood wasn't the safest, but it was the most direct route, and I told myself that as long as I stayed alert, I'd be fine. That night, I had my headphones in, but I kept the volume low, just enough to hear the music, but also the world around me. I remember the song that was playing. It was something soft and melodic, the kind of music that usually calmed me down. But tonight, it did nothing to ease the growing unease in my chest. About halfway home, I noticed him. At first I thought it was just another pedestrian, someone else braving the cold to get where they needed to go. But as I turned the corner onto a quieter street, I realized he was still there, about 20 feet behind me. I slowed my pace, pretending to adjust my scarf, and glanced over my shoulder. He was tall, wearing a dark coat with the hood pulled up, obscuring his face. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and he walked with a steady, deliberate pace. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just another person heading home. But something about the way he moved made my skin crawl. I picked up my pace, my heart starting to race. The street was empty now, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the snow. I glanced back again, and he was still there, maintaining the same distance. My mind started to race. Was he following me, or was I just being paranoid? I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe he lived nearby, that this was just a coincidence. But the longer I walked, the more certain I became that he was following me. I decided to test it. I took a sudden left turn down a side street, one that I knew led to a dead end. If he was just heading home, he'd keep going straight. But as I turned, I heard his footsteps behind me, matching my pace. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickened my steps, my heart pounding now. The side street was darker, the streetlights fewer and farther between. I could feel his presence behind me, like a shadow that refused to be shaken. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for my phone. My hands were trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. I unlocked it and opened the map, looking for the nearest open business or a place where I could duck inside. There was a 24-hour diner about 2 blocks away, and I made a beeline for it, my pace now a near jog. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear his footsteps quickening behind me, the sound of his boots hitting the pavement in sync with mine. The diner was a beacon of light in the darkness, its neon sign glowing like a lifeline. I pushed the door open, the bell jingling loudly as I stepped inside. The warmth hit me like a wave, but I didn't stop to savor it. I hurried to the counter, my hands still shaking as I ordered a coffee I didn't really want. The waitress gave me a curious look, but didn't say anything. I took a seat by the window, my back to the wall so I could see the door. I waited, my eyes glued to the entrance, half expecting him to walk in after me, but he didn't. The minutes ticked by, and I started to relax, telling myself that I had overreacted, that he was just some guy walking home, and I had let my imagination get the best of me. I sipped my coffee, the warmth helping to steady my nerves. After about 15 minutes, I decided it was safe to leave. I paid for my coffee, and stepped back out into the cold, the street now eerily quiet. I had only taken a few steps when I saw him again. He was standing across the street, leaning against a lamppost, his hood still up, his face still hidden. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, unsure of what to do. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I turned and started walking again, this time in the opposite direction, toward a busier street. I could hear his footsteps behind me, steady and relentless. I pulled out my phone again, this time dialing 911. My voice was shaky as I explained the situation to the dispatcher, my eyes darting back to the figure following me. She told me to stay on the line and keep walking toward a well-lit area. I did as she said, my pace quickening as I approached the main road. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I sprinted toward the intersection. I reached the corner just as a police car pulled up, its lights flashing. I waved frantically, and the officer stepped out, his hand resting on his holster. I pointed back toward the side street, but when I turned to look, the man was gone. The officer searched the area, but found no one. He asked me to describe the man, but I realized I couldn't. I hadn't seen his face, hadn't even heard his voice. All I had was the memory of his presence, the feeling of being watched, hunted. The officer drove me home, and I spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. I told myself it was over, that he was gone, but deep down, I knew better. The next day, I changed my route home, taking a longer, busier path. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. A week later, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in messy, scrawled handwriting, just 2 words. I'm closer. I moved out of that apartment the next month, but even now, years later, I still look over my shoulder when I walk home at night, still feel that chill when I hear footsteps behind me, because I know that sometimes, the scariest thing isn't the monster you can see, it's the one you can't. It was a quiet, rainy evening, when I first noticed something was off. I had just moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a place I thought would be perfect for starting fresh. The building was old, with creaky floors and windows that rattled in the wind, but it had charm, the kind of charm that made you feel like you were living in a storybook, even if the story was a little eerie. I didn't mind the occasional strange noise or the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. It was part of the atmosphere, or so I told myself. The first sign that something wasn't right came about a week after I moved in. I was sitting on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, reading a book. The rain was tapping gently against the windows, and the sound was soothing, almost hypnotic. But then I heard it, a soft knock on my door. It was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. I paused, holding my breath, waiting to see if it would come again. A few seconds passed, and then it did. Knock, knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps. I set my book down and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I opened the door just a crack, enough to see if anyone was there, but no one was. The only thing out of place was a small folded piece of paper lying on the doormat. I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, almost childlike, and it read, "I like your curtains. They're pretty." I frowned, confused. My curtains were nothing special, just plain white ones I had bought at a discount store. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was a neighbor playing a prank, or someone who had the wrong apartment. I tossed the note in the trash and went back to my book, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. The next day, I came home from work to find another note. This one was slipped under my door. It said, "You look tired, you should rest more." My heart skipped a beat. How would anyone know if I looked tired? I hadn't seen anyone in the hallway, and I certainly hadn't spoken to any of my neighbors. I crumpled the note and threw it away, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone had seen me coming home late from work and decided to leave a weird note. It didn't mean anything, but the notes kept coming. Every day without fail, there was a new one. Sometimes they were slipped under my door, other times they were left on my doormat. But the messages were always short, always cryptic. "Your hair looks nice today. I like the way you laugh. You should wear blue more often." Each one made my skin crawl a little more. I started to feel like I was being watched, even in the safety of my own home. I tried to convince myself that it was harmless. Maybe it was just someone with a crush, someone who didn't know how to express themselves. But then one night, I heard footsteps outside my door. I was in the kitchen making tea when I froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was pacing back and forth in the hallway. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole again. This time I saw him. He was tall with greasy black hair that hung over his eyes. He wore a grey hoodie, the sleeves stained and frayed. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and he was muttering something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling. He stopped pacing and turned to face my door, his eyes locking onto the peephole as if he could see me through it. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. When I looked again, he was gone. I called the police, but they didn't take me seriously. "Are you sure it wasn't just a neighbor?" they asked. Maybe he was lost. I knew they didn't believe me. I didn't have any proof, just a stack of creepy notes, and a story that sounded like something out of a horror movie. They told me to call back if anything else happened, but I could tell they thought I was overreacting. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. I started checking the locks on my doors and windows obsessively. I bought a security camera and pointed it at my front door, hoping to catch the man in the hoodie if he came back. But he didn't, at least not that I could see. The notes stopped too, and for a while, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe he had gotten bored and moved on. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of my cat hissing. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The room was dark, but I could see the outline of my cat standing at the foot of the bed, his fur bristling. He was staring at the window, his tail twitching. I followed his gaze and froze. There, just outside the window, was a shadow. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see the outline of a person, standing perfectly still watching me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The operator told me to stay calm and that help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity before I heard the sirens. By the time the police arrived, the shadow was gone. They searched the area but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. Just like before, they didn't believe me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with all the lights on, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning I called my landlord and told him I was breaking my lease. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up my things and moved out that same day, leaving behind the creepy nightmares, the shadowy figure, and the feeling of being watched. I thought that would be the end of it, but a few weeks later, I found another note. It was taped to the door of my new apartment. The handwriting was the same, the message just as chilling. "I found you." I didn't call the police this time. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Instead, I packed another bag and left town, hoping to disappear. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting, and every time I close my eyes, I see his shadow, standing just outside my window, staring in. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air feels alive with the scent of fallen leaves and the faint chill of approaching winter. My best friend Sarah and I had decided to take a late-night walk through the quiet neighborhood we grew up in. The streets were familiar, lined with old oak trees whose branches stretched like skeletal fingers against the moonlit sky. We were laughing about something trivial, the kind of laughter that makes your sides ache and your breath short. When I first felt it, a prickle on the back of my neck, like the weight of someone's gaze pressing into me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street was empty, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights. I shook it off, chalking it up to the eerie atmosphere of the season. But as we continued walking, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. Sarah must have noticed my unease because she stopped mid-sentence and asked, "What's wrong?" I told her I felt like we were being watched. She laughed at first, brushing it off as my overactive imagination, but then she paused. Her eyes darted to the shadows between the houses and she whispered, "I feel it too." We quickened our pace, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the stillness. The neighborhood, usually so comforting, now felt like a maze of dark corners and hidden threats. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a distant gate sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept glancing behind us, but there was never anyone there, just the empty street and the faint outline of trees swaying in the breeze. Still, the feeling persisted, like an invisible presence trailing us, always just out of sight. When we reached the park at the end of the street, we hesitated. The playground equipment loomed like strange alien shapes in the darkness, and the path through the park was barely visible under the dim light of the moon. Sarah suggested we cut through to save time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us in the shadows. We decided to take the long way around instead, sticking to the well-lit streets. That's when we heard it, a soft rhythmic sound, like footsteps keeping pace with ours. We stopped, and the sound stopped too. My heart was pounding now, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, too afraid to speak. We started walking again, faster this time, and the footsteps resumed, matching our pace perfectly. I dared to look back once more, and this time I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the light, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette, tall and unnaturally thin, with long arms that hung limply at its sides. "Run," I whispered, and we took off, our feet slapping against the pavement as we sprinted down the street. The footsteps behind us grew louder, faster, more frantic. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. All I could think about was getting home, locking the door, and shutting out whatever was chasing us. We reached my house in what felt like an eternity, fumbling with the keys as our hands shook. Finally, the door swung open, and we stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us and locking it with trembling fingers. We stood there for a moment, leaning against the door, trying to catch our breath. The house was silent, except for the sound of our ragged breathing. I peeked through the window, but the street was empty. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of anyone at all. Sarah and I spent the rest of the night, huddled on the couch, too afraid to sleep, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The next morning, we tried to convince ourselves it had been a trick of the light, a figment of our imaginations, fueled by the spooky atmosphere of the season. But deep down, we both knew better. We had felt it, the presence, the gaze, the footsteps, and even now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling that whatever was following us that night is still out there, waiting, watching, always just out of sight. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. The kind of night where the world feels quieter, slower, as if the darkness itself is holding its breath. I had just left a late shift at work, the kind of shift that leaves your eyes heavy and your mind foggy. The clock on my dashboard glowed a soft 11:47 p.m., and the streets were nearly empty, the occasional streetlight casting long, stretching shadows across the asphalt. My car hummed softly as I drove, the radio playing some faint, almost unrecognizable tune that I wasn't really paying attention to. I was just focused on getting home, on the familiar route I'd taken 100 times before, but something felt off. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in my rearview mirror, a pair of headlights, far enough behind me that I didn't think much of them. They were there, then they weren't, disappearing for a moment as I rounded a corner. I didn't think anything of it, just another late-night driver, probably heading home like me. But then they reappeared, closer this time, and I felt the first prick of unease. The road was narrow, winding through a stretch of woods that separated the town from the outskirts where I lived. There weren't many places to turn off, and the car behind me wasn't slowing down. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my eyes flicking to the mirror again. The headlights were brighter now, closer, too close. I could make out the shape of the car, a dark sedan, its windows tinted so heavily that I couldn't see inside. My heart began to thud in my chest, a slow, heavy rhythm that seemed to echo in the quiet of the car. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the car stayed with me, matching my speed, never falling back. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to focus on the road ahead. The trees loomed on either side of me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The streetlights were fewer now, the darkness between them thicker, more oppressive. I glanced at the mirror again, and this time, the car was closer still, so close that I could see the faint glow of the driver's dashboard lights. My breath hitched, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I told myself to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe they were just in a hurry. Maybe they didn't realize how close they were. I signaled and turned onto a side road, one that would take me through a more residential area, the kind of road where houses lined the streets, where porch lights glowed softly in the night. I hoped the car would keep going, would take the main road and leave me alone. But as I turned, the headlights followed, the dark sedan gliding smoothly behind me. My stomach dropped, and I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't a coincidence. They were following me. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to think of what to do. I could call someone, but my phone was in my bag on the passenger seat, and I didn't want to take my eyes off the road. I could drive to the police station, but it was on the other side of town, and I wasn't sure I could make it there without the car behind me catching up. My mind raced, my thoughts tumbling over each other in a frantic, disjointed mess. I needed to do something, anything, to shake them. I took another turn, this one sharper, and pressed down on the gas pedal. The engine roared, and the car surged forward, the tires gripping the pavement as I sped down the empty street. I glanced in the mirror, my heart pounding, and saw the sedan still there, still following, its headlights like two unwavering eyes in the darkness. I felt a surge of panic, a cold, creeping fear that wrapped itself around me like a vice. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to lose them. The road ahead was straight, lined with tall, ancient trees that seemed to close in on either side. The streetlights were gone now, the only light coming from my own headlights and the ones behind me. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, the silence of the night broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the hum of the engine. I glanced at the mirror again, and this time, the car was closer, so close that I could see the faint outline of the driver's silhouette. My hands tightened on the wheel, my knuckles white. I needed to do something, anything. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. The sedan behind me swerved, its headlights flashing as it veered to the side, narrowly missing my bumper. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I didn't wait, didn't think. I threw the car into reverse and backed up, my eyes fixed on the sedan as it came to a stop a few feet away. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, tall and shadowy, their face obscured by the darkness. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the car into drive and sped off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just drove, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. The road ahead was empty, the darkness stretching out before me like an endless void. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between me and that car as I could. The trees blurred past, the night swallowing everything in its path. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, until the lights of the gas station on the corner glowed like a beacon in the darkness. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still shaking, my breath still coming in short, uneven gasps. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The radio was still playing, the faint tinny sound of a song I didn't recognize filling the silence. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed the number for the police. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain what had happened. All I knew was that I had been followed, that someone had been watching me, waiting for me. The police arrived a few minutes later, their lights flashing in the darkness. I told them everything, my voice shaking as I described the car, the driver, the way they had followed me, the way they had tried to stop me. They listened, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the empty street. They told me they would look into it, that they would patrol the area, but I knew there was little they could do. The car was gone, the driver vanished into the night. I drove home that night, my hands still shaking on the wheel, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. The streets were empty, the night quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was still out there, waiting. I didn't sleep that night, didn't even try. I just sat in my living room, the lights on, the curtains drawn, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The night passed, the sun rose, and the world went on as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget, couldn't shake the feeling of those headlights in my mirror, the shadowy figure stepping out of the car. I still see it sometimes, in my dreams, in the quiet moments when my mind wanders. I still feel the cold creeping fear that wrapped itself around me that night, the fear that someone was watching me, waiting for me. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night, when the streets are empty and the darkness presses in, I glance in the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I think I see those headlights again, those two unwavering eyes in the darkness, and I wonder if they're still out there, still watching, still waiting. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems to slow down, and the only sound you hear is the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I had just finished dinner and was settling into my usual routine of winding down for the night. My house, a modest two-story home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, felt safe and familiar. But that night, something felt off. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the air had grown heavier and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than usual. I brushed it off as my imagination running wild after binge-watching too many horror movies earlier that week. Little did I know, my instincts were trying to warn me. I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, when I first noticed it. The curtains were drawn, but I could have sworn I saw movement outside the window. Just a flicker, like someone passing by. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I told myself it was probably a stray cat or a raccoon rummaging through the trash cans. But the feeling of being watched lingered, like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the words in my book, but my eyes kept darting to the window. Hours passed and the unease grew. I decided to call it a night and headed upstairs to my bedroom. As I climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. I locked my bedroom door behind me, something I rarely did, and climbed into bed. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the house settling. I closed my eyes, willing myself to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little noise, the rustle of the trees outside, the faint hum of the air conditioner, felt amplified, like the house itself was conspiring against me. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the scrape of a shoe against the floorboards. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound came again, this time closer. It was coming from the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, clutching the blanket to my chest. I told myself it was just the house, just the wind, just my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Someone was in my house. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow across the room. I hesitated, unsure whether to call the police or just wait it out, hoping it was nothing. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway toward my door. My blood ran cold. I dialed 911, my fingers fumbling over the numbers. The operator's voice was calm and reassuring, but I could barely speak. "There's someone in my house," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I think they're outside my bedroom door." The operator told me to stay on the line and keep quiet. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and pressed the phone to my ear. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then a soft knock on the door, 3 slow, deliberate raps, like someone was politely asking to be let in. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt like I was going to pass out. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, but it didn't. The doorknob rattled, and I heard the faint click of the lock being tested. My mind raced, trying to remember if I had locked the door. I thought I had, but what if I hadn't? What if they got in? The operator's voice broke through my panic. "The police are on their way. Stay where you are. Do not open the door." I nodded again, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I heard the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling with relief. But the relief was short-lived. The footsteps stopped, and I heard the creak of the stairs. They were going downstairs. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear, listening to the faint sounds of movement below. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Then I heard the sound of the front door, opening and closing. I waited, my heart pounding, until I heard the distant wail of sirens. The police had arrived. I stayed in my room until the officers came upstairs and assured me it was safe to come out. They searched the house but found no one. The front door was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. But I knew what I had heard. I knew someone had been in my house. The police left, and I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, clutching a baseball bat, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, I called a locksmith to change all the locks and installed security cameras around the house. But even with the added security, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every night, I double-checked the locks and slept with the lights on, jumping at every sound. A week later, I found a note slipped under my front door. It was written in messy, scrawled handwriting. "I'm still here," it read. My blood ran cold. I called the police again, but they couldn't do much without evidence. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The notes kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. "I like watching you sleep. You look pretty in blue. I'm closer than you think." I stopped sleeping, too afraid to close my eyes. I started seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, hearing whispers when no one was there. I felt like I was being hunted, like I was prey. One night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I sat up, my heart pounding, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. I screamed, and the figure disappeared. I called the police, but again, they found nothing. I started to wonder if I was going crazy, if the stress and fear had finally gotten to me. But then, one night, I saw him. I was in the kitchen, making tea to calm my nerves, when I glanced out the window and saw a man standing in my backyard. He was tall and thin, with greasy black hair that hung over his eyes. He was just standing there staring at me, a cold, empty look in his eyes. I dropped the teacup, and it shattered on the floor. When I looked back, he was gone. I moved out of the house a week later, unable to stay there any longer. I never saw the man again, but I still feel like he's watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. He's still out there, and he's not done with me yet. It was one of those nights where the sky felt too big, like it was pressing down on the world, heavy and suffocating. The stars were hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the only light came from the flickering street lamps that lined the empty road. We just left a party at Zara's place. Me, Kale, Ilara, and Thorn. The four of us had been friends for years. The kind of bond where you don't even need to speak to know what the others are thinking. But that night, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the wind whispered through the trees, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. Whatever it was, it made the walk home feel like it took forever. We were cutting through the old park, the one with the overgrown trees and the broken fountain. It was a shortcut we'd taken 100 times before, but tonight it felt different. The air was thick, almost sticky, and the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were gone. It was too quiet. That's when I heard it, a soft crunch, like someone stepping on gravel. I stopped walking and turned around, scanning the darkness behind us. Nothing, just the empty path and the faint glow of the streetlights in the distance. "What's wrong, Nix?" Kale asked, his voice low. He was always the calm one, the one who could talk us down from any panic. But even he looked uneasy. "I thought I heard something," I said, trying to shake the feeling that was creeping up my spine. "Probably just a raccoon or something." We kept walking, but the sound didn't stop. It was faint, almost like it was trying to stay hidden, but it was there. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and always just a little too far behind to see who or what was making them. Ilara was the next to notice. She grabbed my arm, her fingers cold and trembling. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "It's following us." I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, that it was just the wind or our own paranoia, but I couldn't, because I heard it too. And so did Thorn. He stopped walking and turned around, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but sharp. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence, and then from somewhere in the shadows a low laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. We didn't wait to see who or what was laughing. We ran. The park seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around us as we sprinted toward the exit. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and every breath felt like fire. When we finally burst out onto the street, we didn't stop. We kept running until we reached Cale's apartment, slamming the door shut behind us and locking it like our lives depended on it. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, jumping at every sound. None of us wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew whatever had been following us wasn't human. The way it had moved, the way it had laughed, it was too calculated, too deliberate, and the worst part, it felt like it knew us. The next morning, we tried to convince ourselves it was just some drunk idiot messing with us. But deep down we all knew better, because when we went back to the park to look for clues, we found something. A single black feather, perfectly placed in the middle of the path, and next to it, scratched into the dirt, were 3 words: "I see you." We never went back to that park, not even during the day, but the feeling of being watched never went away. It's been months now, and I still catch myself looking over my shoulder, checking the locks on my doors, avoiding dark places, because I know it's still out there, watching, waiting, and one day it's going to find us again. It was the middle of July when we moved into the new house, the kind of heat that makes the air feel heavy and the pavement shimmer like water. The house itself was a sprawling Victorian, tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It had been on the market for months, and we got it for a steal. My wife Lila loved the high ceilings and the stained glass windows, and our twins Juniper and Asher were thrilled about the massive oak tree in the backyard with its tire swing. I was just happy to have a home office with a view of the garden, but from the very first night, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't unpleasant, just strange, like old books and damp earth. Lila said it was probably just the house settling after being empty for so long, but it lingered, no matter how many windows we opened or candles we lit. Then there were the sounds, soft rhythmic tapping, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against the walls. It would start just after sunset and stop around midnight. I checked every room, every corner, but there was never any source. Lila joked that it was the house's way of saying hello, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. The first time I saw him, I thought I was imagining things. It was late, and I was in my office, trying to finish up some work. The tapping had started again, and I was doing my best to ignore it. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement in the garden. I turned to look, and there he was, a man, standing perfectly still beneath the oak tree. He was tall, with a lean frame, and he was wearing a dark suit that seemed out of place in the summer heat. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were fixed on the house. I blinked, and he was gone. I didn't tell Lila at first. I didn't want to scare her, but then Juniper started talking about the shadow man who visited her room at night. She said he would stand in the corner and watch her sleep. Asher, who was usually the more outgoing of the two, became withdrawn and refused to go upstairs alone. Lila tried to reassure them, saying it was just their imaginations running wild in a new place, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Things escalated quickly after that. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and went to investigate. The hallway was empty, but the door to the twins' room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and there he was, the man from the garden. He was standing at the foot of Juniper's bed, his head tilted to one side as if he was studying her. I shouted at him to get out, but he didn't move. He just turned to look at me, his expression calm, almost amused, and then, without a word, he walked straight through the wall and disappeared. I called the police the next morning, but they didn't take me seriously. They said it was probably just a prowler or a homeless person looking for shelter. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. This wasn't a prowler, this was something else. We installed security cameras, but they didn't help. The man never showed up on the footage, no matter how many times we saw him with our own eyes. He would appear in the most unexpected places, standing in the kitchen in the middle of the night, sitting in the rocking chair in the nursery, even once in the shower, his dark suit perfectly dry. He never spoke, never touched anything, he just watched. Lila wanted to move, but we couldn't afford to, not after pouring all our savings into the house. So we stayed, and we tried to adapt. We put locks on the inside of the kids' doors and started sleeping with the lights on. But no matter what we did, he was always there, always watching. The breaking point came one night, when I woke up to find him standing at the foot of our bed. Lila was asleep beside me, completely unaware. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He just stood there, staring at me with those cold, empty eyes, and then he spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent chills down my spine. "You don't belong here," he said. "This is my house." I didn't know what to say. I just stared at him, my mind racing. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. We moved out the next week. We didn't care about the money, or the house, or anything else. We just needed to get away. The new owners never contacted us, and I didn't have the heart to tell them what we'd experienced. Sometimes, though, I drive past the old house, just to see if it's still standing. It always is, looking as beautiful and imposing as ever. And sometimes, if I stay too long, I swear I can see him in the window, watching me with that same calm, knowing smile. It was a quiet, unassuming Tuesday evening when I first noticed him. The kind of evening where the world feels still, like it's holding its breath. I had just moved into my new apartment, a small one-bedroom on the third floor of a building that was just old enough to have character, but not so old that it felt haunted, at least not at first. The walls were thin, and I could hear the faint hum of my neighbor's television through the shared wall, but it was comforting in a way. It reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. I had been living there for about 2 weeks when I started to notice the car. It was an old sedan, the kind that had seen better days, parked just across the street from my building. At first, I didn't think much of it. People park on the street all the time, right? But then I noticed it was always there, no matter what time of day or night. Early in the morning when I left for work, it was there. Late at night when I came home, it was still there. And sometimes, when I glanced out my window in the middle of the night, I could see the faint glow of a cigarette ember inside the car, like someone was sitting there watching. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just someone who lived nearby, someone who worked odd hours. But then I started to notice other things, like the way the car would slowly follow me when I walked to the corner store. Not close enough to be obvious, but just enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Or the way it would disappear for a few days, only to reappear just as I was starting to feel safe again. One night, I came home late from work. It had been a long day, and all I wanted was to curl up on the couch with a cup of tea and forget about the world. As I walked up the steps to my building, I felt that familiar prickling sensation, like I was being watched. I turned around, and there it was, the car, parked just across the street. The engine was off, but I could see the faint outline of someone sitting in the driver's seat. My heart started to race, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired. I hurried inside and locked the door behind me, double-checking the deadbolt. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, like a shadow I couldn't quite see. That night, I slept with the lights on. The next morning, I decided to take a different route to work. I told myself it was just to be safe, but deep down I knew I was trying to avoid the car. I left early, walking briskly down the sidewalk, my eyes darting from side to side. I was almost to the bus stop when I heard it, the low rumble of an engine behind me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I turned, and there it was, creeping along the street, keeping pace with me. My stomach dropped, and I quickened my step, but the car did too. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I was just about to break into a run when the car suddenly sped up and turned down a side street, disappearing from view. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. Was it just a coincidence, or had I just narrowly avoided something much worse? That night, I decided to call the police. I told them about the car, about the way it seemed to follow me, about the feeling of being watched. They took my statement, but without a license plate number or a clear description of the driver, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to keep an eye out and call back if anything else happened. For a few days, things were quiet. The car didn't show up, and I started to relax. Maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe I had just been overreacting. But then, one evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside my window. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a soft tapping, like someone was trying to get my attention. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just a tree branch, or maybe a bird, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I crept over to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtain. There, standing on the sidewalk below, was a man. He was tall and thin, with a hood pulled low over his face, obscuring his features. He was looking up at my window, his eyes hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze on me, cold and unblinking. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, letting the curtain fall back into place. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing, before I finally managed to call the police. They arrived quickly, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. They searched the area, but they didn't find anything. They told me to keep my doors and windows locked, and to call them if I saw anything else suspicious. I tried to sleep that night, but every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining the man outside my window, his cold, empty eyes staring up at me. I finally drifted off, just before dawn, but my sleep was restless, filled with nightmares I couldn't quite remember when I woke up. The next few days were a blur. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I started to notice things I hadn't before, like the way my mailbox was always slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had closed it, or the way my trash can was always knocked over, even though there hadn't been any wind. And then there were the notes. The first one appeared on my doorstep one morning, slipped under the door like a secret. It was just a scrap of paper, torn from a notebook, with a single sentence scrawled in messy handwriting. I see you. I stared at it for a long time, my hands shaking, before I finally crumpled it up and threw it away. I told myself it was just a prank, some kids messing around. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The notes kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. You look pretty in blue. I like your hair down. You shouldn't leave your curtains open. Each one sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't know what to do. I started keeping them in a shoebox, like some kind of twisted collection, but I didn't know why. Maybe I thought they would be evidence someday, proof that I wasn't just imagining things. And then one night, it all came to a head. I was in my kitchen, making tea to calm my nerves when I saw him. He was standing in my driveway, tall and thin, his hood pulled low over his face. He was just standing there, staring up at my window, like he had been waiting for me to notice him. My heart stopped, and I dropped the teacup, the sound of it shattering on the floor, barely registering in my mind. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. "Someone's trying to break into my house," I whispered into the phone, my voice trembling. "Please hurry." I hung up and grabbed the small handgun my dad had given me when I moved out. I had never used it before, but I kept it loaded on my nightstand, just in case. I crept to the top of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, the gun clutched tightly in my hands. The house was quiet, but I could feel him out there waiting. And then suddenly, the door flew open, kicked in with such force that the frame splintered. A shadow stepped inside, moving quickly, and I didn't think. I just screamed and pulled the trigger. 3 shots rang out, loud and sharp, and the figure crumpled to the floor. I dropped the gun and stumbled down the stairs, my hands shaking so badly I could barely flip the light switch. When the light came on, my heart stopped. It wasn't the stalker lying there, bleeding out on my floor. It was my neighbor, Tom. His kind face was pale, his chest torn open from the bullets. He had been holding a flashlight, not a weapon. I fell to my knees, sobbing, pressing my hands to his chest, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. He died right there, in my hallway, and when the police arrived minutes later, I was still screaming, covered in his blood, trying to revive him. They took me to the station, and I told them everything, about the car, the notes, the feeling of being hunted. I showed them the shoebox full of evidence, but they didn't believe me. They said the handwriting on the notes matched mine, that the footprints outside my house matched my boots. They said I had made it all up, that the stress of living alone had driven me to delusion. They sent me to a psychiatrist, who diagnosed me as delusional, unfit to stand trial. They locked me in a psych ward, a place with white walls and padded doors, where the nurses looked at me like I was a monster. But I'm not crazy, my stalker was real. I saw him with my own eyes, felt him watching me. The notes, the threats, they weren't in my head. They couldn't have been. I didn't kill Tom on purpose. I thought he was the stalker, come to finally kill me. I thought I was saving myself. But now he's dead, and I'm trapped here, either drugged up or tied down, watched every second. They won't listen. None of them will ever listen. They think I'm a liar, a murderer, a lunatic, but I know the truth. My stalker is still out there, watching, waiting for the next girl whose life he's going to ruin, and I'm the only one who knows he's real. It started subtly, as these things often do. I work in a small, dimly lit office on the 3rd floor of an old building downtown, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights hum faintly, and the air always smells faintly of stale coffee and printer toner. My desk is tucked into a corner, surrounded by filing cabinets and a large window that overlooks the alley below. It's not much of a view, just brick walls and dumpsters, but it's quiet, and I like the solitude, or at least I used to. The first time I noticed something was off. I was staying late to finish a report. It was one of those nights where the office was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the building settling. I was typing away, lost in my work, when I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, and glanced around the room. Nothing. Just the empty desks, the faint glow of my computer screen, and the shadows stretching long across the floor. I shook it off, chalking it up to fatigue. It had been a long day, and I was tired, but the feeling didn't go away. Over the next few weeks, it became a constant companion. I'd be at my desk, and that sensation would creep over me, like invisible fingers brushing against my skin. I started to notice little things that could have been coincidences but felt too deliberate to ignore. My chair would be slightly out of place when I returned from the break room. Papers on my desk would be shuffled, as if someone had been rifling through them. Once, I found a coffee cup on my desk that wasn't mine, still warm, as if someone had just set it there moments before. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the cleaning crew was coming in earlier than usual. Maybe one of my co-workers was playing a prank, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. It followed me home, lingered in the back of my mind as I tried to sleep. I started to dread going to work, but I couldn't explain why. There was no evidence, no proof that anything was wrong, just that feeling. Then one night, I saw him. It was late, well past midnight, and I was the only one left in the office. I was packing up my things, eager to get home, when I glanced out the window. The alley below was dark, the street light flickering weakly. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving where it shouldn't. But then I saw him, a man standing perfectly still, staring up at my window. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his eyes on me, unblinking, unwavering. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. When I looked again, he was gone. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But the next night, he was there again. And the night after that, always in the same spot, always staring up at me. I started closing the blinds, but it didn't help. I could still feel him, watching me through the slats. I tried to convince myself it was harmless. Maybe he was just a homeless man, seeking shelter in the alley. Maybe he didn't even realize I was there. But then the notes started appearing. Slips of paper left on my desk, always when I wasn't looking. At first they were innocuous, just a few words scribbled in messy handwriting. You work too hard. You look tired, but they grew more personal, more unsettling. I like the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating. Your perfume smells like lavender. It's my favorite. I reported it to my boss, but there wasn't much he could do. Security footage showed nothing unusual, and no one else in the office had seen anything out of the ordinary. I started carrying pepper spray and a small pocket knife, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The notes kept coming, and the man in the alley became a constant presence, always watching, always waiting. One night, I decided to confront him. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or the constant fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. I waited until the office was empty, then grabbed my things and headed downstairs. The alley was dark and quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. I stepped out into the cool night air, my heart racing, and looked around. He wasn't there. Relief washed over me, and I let out a shaky breath. Maybe it was over. Maybe he had finally gotten bored and moved on. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the scrape of a shoe against concrete. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly I turned around. He was standing at the other end of the alley, his face still hidden in shadow, but this time, he wasn't just watching. He was moving toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. I backed away, my hand fumbling for the pepper spray in my bag. But before I could reach it, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I was happy just watching. "But now you've made this personal. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was safely inside my apartment, the door locked behind me. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. There was no trace of him, no evidence that he had ever been there. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't go back, not after that. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching me. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear a sound that shouldn't be there. And I know deep down that he's waiting for the moment when I let my guard down, waiting to make it personal again.